They began visiting less. Calls came short and scheduled, as if family love were a meeting on their calendars. When they did appear, it was in expensive cars that didn't fit the dirt road. They'd step out, their shoes sinking slightly in the dust, and glance at our home as though calculating its value. Jasmine, Charles's new wife, would wrinkle her perfect nose and say, "It's cozy," which meant small, poor, unworthy. Through it all, my husband remained my shelter. On hard nights, he would take my hands and remind me that every roof needs a little rain to prove itself. He smelled of clean oil and cedar soap, the scent of work done right. We kept our rituals: coffee at dawn, a shared orange at noon, a slow walk at dusk to count how many windows in town glowed with supper. I told him the truth I could carry, that love was our real house, and we were not moving. It began with the smell of smoke on a morning that should have been ordinary. I remember stirring sugar into my coffee when the sirens started to scream, distant at first, then sharp and near enough to cut through the air. The neighbor's dog howled. I stepped onto the porch, the cup trembling in my hand. A column of black smoke rose from the direction of Ernest's shop, thick, oily, unnatural. Then came the first suggestion, soft, careful, deadly. "Mom, Dad," Charles said, laying down a folder thick with papers. "I've been looking into options. You could sell the house, retire somewhere comfortable. We could handle everything." His tone carried the practiced smoothness of a salesman who believes his own pitch. Ernest's jaw tightened. "This house is our comfort," he said. "It's our history." Charles smiled, the kind of smile that listens only to itself. When the boys became men, our quiet house began to echo with a new kind of silence, the kind filled with ambition and absence. Charles returned from the city wearing success like a tailored suit. His watch gleamed louder than his laughter, and his words came wrapped in advice we never asked for. Henry followed behind him as always, his tie too tight, his smile rehearsed. They looked at the old porch and the leaking roof as though pitying a relic. I tried to bridge the distance with kindness, cooking Ernest's best roast, setting the table with our wedding china. But their phones buzzed through dinner, their eyes glowing with other lives. When Ernest told stories from the shop, Henry scrolled through messages. When I spoke about the garden, Charles checked the time. Love had turned into politeness, and politeness is just silence dressed nicely. The sky was grey that morning, heavy with the weight of loss. My name is Margot Hayes, and I'm 66 years old. The funeral of my husband, Ernest, felt like the quietest day the world had ever known. Even the wind refused to move, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. As the boys grew, so did the distance between the life we had and the life they imagined. Charles asked why our car was patience and not chrome. He wanted shoes that squeaked on clean floors, not scuffed ones that told the story of play. He was quick, clever, hungry. Henry followed, quieter but orbiting the same new sun. At 15, Charles began counting dollars like heartbeats. At 16, he said the shop smelled like old metal and old ideas. Ernest chewed the edge of silence and swallowed his hurt with coffee he didn't sweeten. By the time I reached the street, people were running. Mr. Dugan from the post office shouted something I couldn't hear. The smell hit next. Burnt rubber, gasoline, and something metallic that didn't belong. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the chaos, my breath shallow and cold. I saw the roof sagging inward, flames licking the edges of Ernest's sign. Someone said, "They pulled him out, barely breathing." The reply came within seconds. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." My breath caught. Our sons? Charles and Henry stood only a few steps away, their faces composed, their suits immaculate. They looked like two strangers pretending to mourn. I remember one autumn evening when the light turned copper and the air promised frost. Ernest sat with Charles on the steps and offered him a place at the counter in the shop, a path made of tools and trust. Charles stared at his hands as if they were already wearing different gloves. "I won't spend my life tightening other people's bolts," he said, not cruelly, but not gently either. The sentence floated between us and never quite landed. Henry's eyes followed it like a kite that had found a stronger wind. The phone slipped from my grasp, landing softly on the wet grass. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the pastor's final words. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my family began to crack open at that moment. Because if Ernest wasn't in that coffin, then whose body had I just buried? I was 24 when I first saw Ernest, the way a person sees the horizon after a long fog. Spring Creek was small enough that everyone waved, but that morning the town felt new. I walked past the bicycle shop in a faded green dress, carrying thread and pins for the day's sewing, when he stepped out with grease on his fingers and shyness in his eyes. "Good morning, Margot," he said, and the way he said my name sounded like a door opening. I didn't own a bicycle, but I told him my neighbour's chain slipped, and he smiled like he could fix more than metal. When Charles was born, Ernest cried the way a strong dam breaks, quietly at first, then all at once. The baby had Ernest's big eyes and my stubborn mouth, and the world widened around his small fists. 2 years later came Henry, patient and watchful, as if he arrived already listening. The house filled with soft thunder, baby hiccups, lullabies over the hum of the box fan, the click of Ernest's tools settling at night. We traded sleep for wonder and never asked for change back. At the hospital, the white walls felt too clean for what had just happened. Machines beeped their indifference beside my husband's broken body. His hands, those hands that once built and repaired everything, were wrapped in gauze, trembling even in sleep. A nurse whispered that the fire started near the workbench, where Ernest kept the solvents and metal polish. "A freak accident," she said. But Ernest never left his station messy. I knew that. One night, I found Ernest sitting alone on the porch, the lamplight carving gentle sorrow across his face. "Our boys don't see us anymore, Margot," he said. "They see opportunity." I took his hand and said nothing, because silence was all we had left that felt honest. The following weeks were filled with small betrayals, visits that ended early, laughter that didn't reach the eyes, birthday cards signed but not felt. Ernest's once steady hands began to shake, not from age, but from heartache. "Mom, you can't keep living like this," Charles said one Sunday, his voice half affection, half business proposal. "You and Dad deserve better." But I could hear what he didn't say. "This place embarrasses me." Ernest only nodded, his hands folded in the quiet defense of dignity. That night, he whispered, "Money's a fine thing, Margot, until it buys a person's heart." Then, my phone buzzed. For a moment, I thought it was a condolence message, but the words on the screen froze my blood. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." I blinked, convinced that grief was playing cruel tricks on my mind. My hands trembled as I typed back, "Who are you?" That night, the house felt heavier than grief. The scent of smoke clung to Ernest's jacket hanging by the door. I sat in his chair, tracing the worn fabric where his arm used to rest. On the table lay an envelope, plain, unmarked. Inside were the shop's receipts and a note written in Ernest's firm, slanted handwriting. Keep this safe. Don't trust them with the numbers. We courted under the old oak in the square, the one that threw patchy shade like a quilt. Ernest talked more with his hands than his mouth, drawing diagrams of repairs in the air, and I fell in love with the patience behind those gestures. We were poor in things and rich in hope. When rain came through the tin roof of my mother's house, he arrived with buckets and jokes, lining the drips like a band leader. I learned the map of his laugh, and he learned how I took my coffee, sweet enough to believe in tomorrow. The next morning, the insurance agent called. His voice was polite, but his words were lined with curiosity. "I just need to confirm," he said. "Your husband recently increased his coverage amount significantly, correct?" My breath caught. I hadn't known. He continued. 2 weeks ago, the beneficiary was changed to your sons, both names, jointly. When the first clods of soil struck the lid, the sound travelled up my bones. I reached for Ernest's ring on the chain around my neck and whispered a goodbye I didn't believe. A buzz rose from my purse, soft as a gnat, sharp as a bullet. I thought it was another condolence, a casserole in text form. I slid the phone out, shielding the screen with my palm from the grey light. I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. Charles arrived first, breathless, but immaculate. "Mom," he said, gripping my shoulders with rehearsed urgency. "We'll take care of everything." Henry followed, quieter, eyes darting between me and the door. They brought coffee, phone calls, paperwork. It was all efficiency and no emotion. When I asked them to sit by their father's side, Charles checked his watch. "We've got to talk to the insurance adjuster," he murmured. Ernest's heart monitor beeped louder, as if objecting for him. Late one night, after everyone had gone, I sat by the window with a candle. The flame flickered in the draught, throwing shadows across the walls. I opened Ernest's old notebook, the one where he kept every part number, every supplier, every customer who still owed $5 from 1987. On the last page, written shakily but clear, were the words, "If something happens to me, look for the ledgers. They'll tell you who planned it." The cemetery felt smaller than I remembered, as if grief had pressed the world inward. A low sky folded over Spring Creek, and the wind carried the metallic smell of wet earth and lilies. I stood beside the open grave in my black dress, holding a handkerchief that had already surrendered, watching the coffin descend like a final, slow breath. The pastor's voice moved through the air like smoke. There, and then gone. Doris squeezed my elbow. Charles and Henry stood opposite me, perfect in every crease, expressionless. The words were so simple they felt childish, and still they pried the day open. My lungs forgot their work. I typed with hands that wouldn't obey me. "Who is this?" A reply arrived before I could lift my eyes. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." Something in me tilted, the way a room tilts when the floor gives. I looked across the grave to Charles and Henry. Their ties were straight. Their grief was straightened too. The day after the funeral, I woke before the sun and laid Ernest's ledger books on the kitchen table like sacred texts. The house was still, a clock made of dust and memory. I brewed coffee strong enough to argue with, then opened the first red notebook. Suppliers, parts, petty cash. The handwriting was all earnest, square, patient, honest. Near the back, the entries thinned and then wavered, as if someone had nudged his hand. I ran my fingers over the grooves his pen had pressed into the paper, feeling for what he couldn't say aloud. Beneath a false bottom, 2 brads and a piece of plywood, the kind of simple trick you learn by kneading it, I found a paper envelope with my name in his neat, stubborn hand. Inside, a photocopy of the old beneficiary designation with my name circled in blue ink, a list of phone numbers labelled "Keep these," "Not safe" on the wall, and a note the size of a grocery receipt. If anything happens, start with the policy rider. It wasn't my idea. I went to the bank with a folder under my arm and a promise not to cry. Mrs. Thompson met me in her glass office with water and kindness. When I asked for 6 months of statements, she printed them without questions. The numbers glowed on the page like quiet alarms, withdrawals in round figures, 1,000, 3,000, 4,000, cash that had left the account with a confident stride. The signatures on the withdrawal slips were Ernest's, almost. If Ernest wasn't in that coffin, whose name had we just spoken into the ground? And if the message was a lie, who knew us well enough to steer the knife exactly where we broke? I did not cry then. I gathered what remained of myself, thanked the pastor, hugged Doris, and stepped away from the hole that pretended to be an ending. The world had moved on to sandwiches and soft voices. I kept walking, one small footstep after another, feeling the question widen into a road I would have to take alone. At home, I made rows of dates across the table. Doctor visits, insurance changes, bank withdrawals, the day the shop supposedly burned. When I connected them with a ruler, lines crossed the wood like cracks in ice. I found notes in Ernest's pocket ledger where numbers should have been. Charles insists. Jay called again. Don't sign anything without Margot. The plea and the defiance lived in the same cramped margin. I called Doris and asked for her memory, like a borrowed cup of sugar. 2 days before the fire, she said, I saw Charles leaving your house with a messenger envelope. He was in a hurry. She lowered her voice. I thought he was finally helping Ernest with the paperwork. You know, being a good son. We let the silence tell us what it really was. Our wedding was simple. A borrowed dress and a cake carried across 2 blocks. Someone played a cracked piano that could hit every note except the right one at the right time. We didn't mind. We had a 2-bedroom house where the floors complained, a porch that faced the evening light, and a future we were stubborn enough to deserve. He kept his father's shop alive with honest repairs, and I hemmed sleeves, altered dresses, pinned prom dreams into fabric. On Sundays, we walked to the river with bread we couldn't spare and still fed the ducks, as if generosity were a muscle you strengthened or lost. Henry checked his watch. Charles nodded at the pastor, as if signalling a meeting could now end. I slipped the phone back, my thumb slick with sweat, and felt the tremor run through my ribs. Dirt kept falling. The pastor spoke of rest and peace, 2 words that suddenly sounded like disguises. Doris leaned closer, whispering if I needed water. I shook my head. The wind lifted the edge of my veil like a question. I moved to his workbench in the shed. The place was neat, the way a chapel is neat. Tools hung in order. The pegboard was a map of faith. Behind a row of labelled jars, I found a small tin that once held throat lozenges. Inside, a ring of keys, 2 Polaroids of the shop taken from odd angles, and a note the size of a matchbook. If anything happens, top drawer, false back. I slid the top drawer out and felt for resistance. A plywood panel shifted beneath my fingers like a confession. Behind it lay a letter addressed to me in his stubborn, careful script. My dearest Margot, it began. If you're reading this, it means I was too slow to stop something, or too proud to call it what it is. Our boys are not the boys I raised. Charles brings papers he smiles through. Henry asks about routines a little too often. Jasmine talks like money can bless sin. I felt the words grip me by the shoulders. I increased the policy because Charles would not let it rest. He said it was for your safety. It felt like buying a lock for a door someone else held the key to. Charles insists. The first line sat alone, underlined twice. Below it, J pushing again, says faster. Don't like the smell of this. Don't sign if Margot isn't there. A date in the corner, 3 weeks before the fire. The letters were earnests, but tighter, as if written while listening for footsteps. The next morning, I searched the house the way a person searches a dream for an exit. Ernest had been orderly, but he also believed in leaving breadcrumbs where fear might come to feed. I started in the bedroom, his nightstand, the shoebox under the bed, the jacket pockets we never emptied because pockets remember what we forget. In the lining of his winter coat, a seam lifted like a sigh. I unpicked 4 careful stitches and slid out a folded paper, thin as breath. The station smelled like floor wax and old coffee, the kind of place where tired truths outlast lies. I asked for Sergeant O'Connell and waited beneath a bulletin board full of lost dogs and neighbourhood meetings that would never fix what was broken. When he came out, he had the kind eyes of a man who'd seen too much and learned to speak gently anyway. We sat in a small room with a table that had been interrogated more than I had. I began with the simple arithmetic of suspicion. Receipts in one pile, bank statements in another, insurance policy folders in a third. The policy I remembered from years ago was small, practical, enough to bury a man and leave his widow breathing. But tucked beneath it was a glossy new binder with a recent date and generous numbers, more zeros than we had ever trusted in our house. My name wasn't on the beneficiary line. Charles and Henry, jointly. My throat tightened, as if someone had moved the air 2 inches farther away. Night came shallow and restless. I spread the documents on the floor like constellations and lay down beside them, trying to name the shapes. Ernest's handwriting, brave, careful, moved through the pages like a thread trying to stitch torn cloth. I followed it until my eyes ached and the room blurred. Somewhere past midnight, I stood, gathered the most damning sheets, and slid them into a new folder with a single word on the tab. Motive. I placed everything on the bed in a careful grid. Letter, notes, keys, photos, like laying out instruments before a difficult surgery. The house was quiet enough to hear dust land. I imagined Ernest, alone at this same bed, deciding which truths I would need if the worst arrived, measuring which warning could fit inside love without breaking it. Outside, the afternoon had the colour of paper left in the sun. I walked to the curb and held Ernest's ring in my palm. The wind moved through the trees and sounded like water. For the first time since the funeral, the world made a brutal kind of sense. There had never been a fire to explain, only a silence to unmask. I closed my hand around the ring and felt it answer. Cool, unyielding, true. Why was I told there was a shop accident? I asked. Why did the doctors talk about smoke and flames? O'Connell folded his hands. The chart shows a confidentiality request signed by immediate family, limiting disclosure to accidental injury language to protect the patient's dignity. He let the word family rest between us like a dropped plate. Did you sign it? No, I said, my own voice arriving from a far-off place. I was never asked. He watched my face the way a medic watches a pulse. Mrs. Hayes, do you believe Mr. Hayes was intentionally poisoned? The truth had been knocking for days. Now it stepped in and sat down. Yes, I said. And I believe my sons know why. O'Connell stood, crossed to a cabinet, returned with a thin folder. The hospital still has samples, he said. We can request confirmatory toxicology and, if you consent, open an investigation. It will be intrusive and painful. Interviews, subpoenas, possibly an exhumation to verify cause of death. I stared at my hands. The left still wore Ernest's ring, warm from my skin. "Do what you have to do," I told him. "Do what is necessary." He nodded once, a promise with a badge on it, and began to list what he needed. Copies of the insurance amendments, bank withdrawals, phone numbers, the names attached to initials in Ernest's notes. "I've eaten," I said, "and I prefer tea." I didn't look at the box. I didn't look at the thermos. I looked at their eyes, which were busy with calculations. Jasmine slipped into a chair without being asked, crossing her legs like a switchblade folding. "Margot," she began, sweet as frosting left too long in the sun. "We all think you need rest. Grief can make misunderstandings." She lowered her voice in a confidential perfume of concern. "Doris told us you've been going to the police, asking odd questions that can look unwell." He printed a form and slid it to me as if it might bite. "This is what we do have," he said. "A hospital intake note from Tuesday morning. Patient, Ernest Hayes. Condition, critical. Suspected toxic exposure." The words staggered across the page. "Toxic?" I whispered. "As in poison?" O'Connell nodded. The attending physician recorded symptoms consistent with methanol ingestion: visual disturbance, metabolic acidosis, rapid neurological decline. Lab work flagged methanol levels. The room made a sound like wind in a dead tree. From the closet floor, I pulled a shoebox labelled "Old Warranty Cards." Beneath the cards lay a card no warranty could cover. Stephen Callahan, licensed investigator. A smaller note paper-clipped to it. "Met with SC 3 weeks ago. If boys keep pushing, tell him rider clause and coffee. He'll understand. Coffee." The word rang like a bell in a ruined church. I held the letter against my chest and breathed until the room stopped spinning. Ernest had not been careless. He had been careful in a language I was only now learning to read. His warnings did not accuse for sport. They pointed, like a compass laid on a map someone has tried hard to fold wrong. I put the letter back in its envelope and slid it into my purse. I locked the tin, pocketed the keys, and stood in the doorway of our room. "I hear you," I said into the ordinary air. "I'm listening now." They came the next morning together, as if arriving in formation. Charles at the front with his salesman's smile, Henry half a step behind, like a shadow that wanted to be a man. Jasmine followed in a coat the colour of wet cherries, her perfume crowding the doorway before her voice did. I had set the table with nothing but a glass of water, because I'd learned what kindness could be used to carry. "Mum," Charles said, widening the room with his charm, "we're worried about you." He placed a white box on the table. "From the bakery you like, raspberry tarts." Henry added, "And we brought the good coffee, the one you used to ask for on Sundays." He lifted a thermos like an offering. The air pressed heavier on my chest, the way weather warns the body before it changes. Silence landed like a hawk. Henry swallowed and looked at the floor, as if hoping the boards would open and offer him a different childhood. Charles's jaw softened, then hardened like cooling metal. "Mum," he said softly, "listen to me. You're tired. You're imagining connections that don't exist. The insurance, Dad wanted that. He told me so. He asked me to help because you get overwhelmed by paperwork. You always have." Charles smiled his professional smile, the one that had sold houses that didn't face the sun. "Mum, this isn't an attack. It's compassion with structure. We're recommending a short stay at a centre for recovery. Just until you're yourself again." He slid a brochure across the table. A garden, a gazebo, a woman with white hair laughing into a sky no one gets to keep. I slid it back without touching it. "Myself is standing in my kitchen, in my home, reading what the police read to me. Methanol. Do you want me to spell it? Or will your hands do the shaking for you? Charles, this policy isn't right. It's too high. You're setting something up I don't understand. Charles's voice came back smooth as oil. It's just paperwork, Dad. For Mum's sake. You worry too much. And the whiskey? Ernest asked. Tastes off lately. That's from the new bottle. Relax. You're making it sound like we're trying to kill you. Then Henry's voice, small, broken. Maybe we already have. Henry set the thermos down too quickly. The lid rattled like a warning. You see? He said to Charles, not to me. She's getting suspicious again. This is what Dr. Albright described. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Complicated grief becoming paranoia. Jasmine leaned forward eagerly, like a student who knows the answer because she wrote the test. We spoke with him at my cousin's clinic, she said. He's quite respected. Respected people can sign disrespected lies, I replied. My voice had become something new, a blade I hadn't known I was polishing. Worse, Callahan replied. They also filed a guardianship petition for you, citing mental instability, signed by a Dr. Albright. Same name Henry mentioned? Yes. The word left like smoke. He's real, but the signature isn't his. I spoke to him this morning. He's never evaluated you. Your sons used his name to fast-track a competency order. If it had gone through, they'd have taken full control of your finances, your home, everything. The kitchen light flickered, as if the house itself had heard too much. When the door closed, the room stood perfectly still, as if listening to its own heartbeat. I opened the window and let the air change. The perfume left first, then the lie of the coffee, then the brochure's laughter. On the table, the glass of water kept its small light. I poured it down the sink and watched the spiral take it. That night, I gathered the evidence back into its folders, the way a shepherd gathers sheep before wolves chance a second try. On the top, I placed Ernest's letter, last paragraph visible. Trust your eyes more than your love. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark until the dark stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a witness. Through the window, the streetlight made a pale coin on the floor. I did not pick it up. I did not need luck. I needed morning. 3 days passed before the knock came. Not the kind of knock that asks permission. Measured, deliberate, the rhythm of someone who already knows you'll open. When I did, a man stood there with rain on his coat and the calm of a person who'd long ago stopped being surprised by cruelty. Mrs. Hayes? He asked. His voice had the kind of patience that could outweigh guilt. Yes, I said. He lifted a small leather wallet. Stephen Callahan, Private Investigations. I need the report on my husband's shop explosion, I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. O'Connell glanced at a screen, tapped keys, frowned. Mrs. Hayes, he said carefully. There's no report of an explosion at Hayes Repairs. I felt the chair tip backward inside my body. But the hospital, my sons, everyone said. He shook his head once, like a slow door closing. We received no call, no fire report, no scene log. I sent that clip to the police after the toxicology results came in, he said quietly. They're reclassifying his death as a homicide. But there's more. You need to see this. He pulled out another document, a series of bank transactions. This is from Ernest's joint account. These withdrawals match deposits into an account in Charles's name. And here, he pointed to a ledger column. Policy beneficiary change, 2 months before Ernest's death. Digital signature, but handwriting analysis shows your signature was forged. I stared at the papers until the numbers started to hum. So they poisoned him, I said, and planned to take the money. I kept my hands flat on the table, as if pinning down a map. I spoke to Sergeant O'Connell, I said. There was no explosion. The sentence hung like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Charles didn't blink. Henry blinked twice, hard enough to push back tears that had not been invited. Charles cleared his throat. Mum, hospitals make mistakes. Paperwork gets confused. The important thing is you rest and let us handle the details. He unscrewed the thermos, and a friendly steam rose like a ghost pretending to be human. Just have a sip. You're shaking. Callahan kept his tone gentle. Your husband knew this was coming. He said if I found you alone, frightened, and doubting yourself, to remind you that love can be used as camouflage by the guilty. He handed me a sealed envelope. He wrote this for you the week before he died, asked me to deliver it personally. I opened it. Ernest's handwriting leaned like it was hurrying toward me. My dearest Margot, if Stephen brings you this, it means I was right to be afraid. I tried to fix it quietly, but greed listens louder than love. Protect yourself. Don't eat or drink what they offer. Don't sign anything. You'll want to believe they're still your boys. Don't. You're the only honest witness left in this family. What's left of me is in the truth. Carry it like a lantern. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Ernest, sitting on his workbench, smiling with fatigue. 2 Polaroids of the whiskey bottles labelled Friday batch, and a third, taken the night before the so-called explosion. A blurred shot of Ernest locking his shed door, time-stamped 10:47 p.m. He was preparing to confront them, Callahan said. He recorded a conversation that night. He sent me a partial copy before his phone went offline. He slid over a small USB drive. Would you like to hear it? I nodded. He plugged the drive into his recorder. Static filled the air, then Ernest's voice. Steady, worn, familiar as prayer. The phrase, court scrutiny, tasted metallic in my mouth. Show me, I said. He began with the recordings. Ernest's voice filled the room again, but now there were faces to match the voices. Charles and Henry, captured on hidden camera footage from the workshop Ernest had secretly installed weeks before his death. The screen showed Charles uncapping a whiskey bottle, pouring it into 2 glasses, then adding a few drops from a small vial. Henry's hand trembled. Dad'll notice, he said. Charles replied, calm as stone. He never did before. Callahan paused the video. This was recorded the night before his hospitalization. The audio matches the time code on the file Ernest sent me. I had it authenticated by a forensic lab. No edits. I couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, like truth itself was pressing its palms against the walls. He moved to the next file, a scan of a bank authorization. Here's the digital forgery. I cross-checked the metadata. The signature pretending to be yours came from Charles's office computer, same timestamp as an IP address linked to his brokerage account. Henry signed as witness. I leaned forward, tracing my name where it shouldn't have been. They used my name to erase him, I said. Not anymore, Callahan replied. We're taking it back. My throat closed around the word, boys. You tested it? I did, Callahan said. Traces of methanol in 2 of the 3 bottles. Not enough to kill in one sitting, but cumulative exposure. He stopped when he saw my hands shaking. He said if anything happened to him, I was to contact you directly, but then his sons blocked all access to medical records, claiming family rights. I sat down slowly. He knew they were doing it, I said. He suspected, Callahan corrected gently. He wanted proof before going to the police. He didn't want to ruin them if he was wrong. I told him I'd keep digging. By the time I reached the lab results, he was already in the hospital. "I'll meet O'Connell tomorrow," Callahan said. "We'll coordinate evidence, issue warrants. It won't be quick, but it will be thorough." He gathered the documents, leaving copies for me in a neat stack. "One last thing," he added. "Ernest asked me to make sure you didn't blame yourself. He said you loved enough for 3 people. That's why they couldn't fool you forever." Outside, rain began again, tapping the windows like a quiet applause for the truth finally spoken aloud. I walked him to the door. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." He smiled, barely. "Ernest would have liked to see you fight." The day after the arrests, Spring Creek felt unnaturally still. The news had already spread through whispers that carried from porch to porch. Her own sons. I spent the morning in silence, listening to the wind move the curtains like someone sighing. When Sergeant O'Connell called, I expected formality, but his tone was gentle. "They're cooperating," he said. "You did the right thing. We spent hours arranging everything into labeled folders, medical reports, toxicology, financial fraud, recorded confession. My handwriting filled the margins, dates, notes, cross-references, all the small anchors that keep truth from floating away." At noon, Callahan called Sergeant O'Connell. "We're ready," he said simply. From the look on his face, I could tell the man on the other end didn't need persuasion. When he hung up, I asked, "Will they come today?" "Soon," he said. "O'Connell's bringing his forensic team. They'll want to make digital copies of everything and prepare arrest warrants. He told me to keep you inside, in case the brothers try to visit before the news breaks." The next morning dawned pale and clean, like a blank page the storm had scrubbed for truth. Stephen Callahan arrived again just after 7, the smell of rain still clinging to his coat. This time he carried a laptop case instead of a folder. I made tea for both of us, though neither of us drank much. He placed the laptop on the table and opened a series of files. "I've compiled everything," he said. "Audio, video, transaction records, handwriting comparisons, call logs. It's enough for the police to act, but we'll need to structure it so it survives court scrutiny." The air was bright and merciless. Reporters waited by the curb, cameras flashing like lightning in daylight. "Mrs. Hayes, any comment?" they shouted. I didn't stop. What could I say? That justice and heartbreak had the same face? When I left the office, Jasmine was there, red-eyed, trembling, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Mrs. Hayes, please," she said, clutching my sleeve. "You have to drop the charges. He's not evil. He's lost." I pressured him. I told him to find money. It's my fault too. Her words fell apart like wet paper. I looked at her, this young woman who'd once eaten dinner at my table and rolled her eyes at our modest house. And I felt nothing but exhaustion. "He poisoned his father," I said softly. "There's no apology that can touch that." She collapsed onto a bench, sobbing into her hands as Stephen guided me outside. That phrase, "the right thing," didn't sound like victory. It sounded like something carved from pain. Stephen drove me to the station again so I could sign a few more statements. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and disinfectant, that mixture of bureaucracy and relief. He waited near the door, quiet, hands folded. O'Connell handed me a folder of updates. The exhumation order, the medical examiner's report, the lab results confirming methanol in Ernest's body. Proof that love had been murdered by greed. I looked at the window. The street outside was bright again, clean but cautious. "They'll come," I said. "Not because of guilt, because they always check their traps." Callahan smiled faintly. Then let them find one waiting. We printed duplicates of every file, sealing them in envelopes marked Evidence, Hayes Case. I insisted on handwriting each label myself. My fingers ached, but the motion steadied me. For every sheet we filed, I felt Ernest's hand guiding mine. He opened another folder labeled Insurance Evidence. These photos were taken 2 days before Ernest's death. He looks unwell, blurred vision, flushed skin, signs of methanol poisoning. You can see the tremor in his hands. The images were difficult to look at. Ernest, trying to hold his coffee mug, smiling faintly at someone behind the camera. He had been documenting his own decline as evidence. I realized he'd known exactly how this story might end. Callahan's tone softened. He wasn't just leaving you clues, Margot. He was building a case from the grave. The name turned the air solid. The same name Ernest had written on the business card hidden beneath warranty papers. You knew my husband. Callahan nodded. He hired me 6 months before he died, said he was worried about unusual withdrawals and that his sons were pushing for a policy increase. He stepped inside without arrogance, just quiet authority. His shoes left small constellations of rain on the floor. He laid a folder on my table, the same table where Charles had tried to serve me kindness with a side of poison. He suspected fraud, Callahan continued. And something else. Said he was getting headaches, nausea, thought it was stress. He sent me samples of the whiskey he drank with his boys every Friday night. That afternoon, the exhumation was carried out under grey clouds. I stood at the edge of the cemetery, the same spot where I had buried Ernest, and watched men lift the casket as gently as one might lift a wounded child. Stephen stood beside me, hat in hand. We'll have confirmation by tomorrow, he said quietly. When the results arrived, lethal concentration of methanol, deliberate ingestion, I sat at our kitchen table and cried without sound. Not because I was surprised, but because the truth had finally stopped being invisible. For the first time, Ernest could rest, and so could I. The courthouse doors closed behind me, but the echo of the gavel lingered in my bones like a heartbeat. Justice had come, but it did not arrive in triumph. It came quietly, like dawn after a storm. For the first time in months, I didn't feel hunted by shadows. The silence outside the courtroom wasn't emptiness, it was release. Ernest's name had been cleared, his truth carved into the record for all to see. Defense counsel tried to paint Ernest as delusional, claiming stress and paranoia caused hallucinations. But Callahan's documentation tore through the lies, timestamps, metadata, toxicology, every digital fingerprint screaming truth. When the prosecution played the recording of Henry's trembling voice, maybe we already have. The courtroom fell to a silence so deep it could have been prayer. By afternoon, the table looked like a war room. Photographs, printouts, timelines, sticky notes, all arranged in patterns of betrayal. Callahan pointed to the central page where Ernest's signature glowed faintly from an old scan. That's where it started, he said. I nodded. And this? I tapped the letter from Ernest, framed now under glass, is where it ends. He looked at me for a long moment. You're stronger than anyone I've met. I just ran out of fear, I said. We worked until the light turned amber and long shadows stretched across the papers. Callahan finally closed the laptop. O'Connell will meet us at the precinct tomorrow morning, he said. He'll take your statement officially. After that, they'll go for the arrests. I gathered the folders into a neat pile and tied them with twine. Then tomorrow, I said quietly, we open the door to justice. Callahan nodded. and you carry the lantern." The words made me smile for the first time in months. The light outside faded, leaving only the warm pulse of the lamp reflecting in Ernest's photograph. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The courthouse smelled of wood polish and nerves. Months had passed since the arrests, but the tension hadn't faded. It had only ripened, like something sealed too long in the dark. The trial of Charles and Henry Hayes versus the state drew a quiet crowd every morning. They came not for spectacle, but for curiosity, a small town's hunger to see how far blood can curdle. I sat behind the prosecutor's table beside Stephen Callahan. He wasn't required to be there, but he came anyway, notebook in hand, jaw tight. Sergeant O'Connell sat 2 rows behind us, arms crossed, the silent presence of a man who'd already heard too many confessions. Back home, the house felt different. The same worn furniture, the same clock ticking above the mantel, but the air was lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I walked from room to room, touching every photograph, every small piece of our life. The ache of loss had not left me, but it no longer poisoned the air. Ernest had died for love and integrity, and now his story belonged to justice, not tragedy. The words fell like stones into water, ripples spreading through every corner of that courtroom, through every whispered judgment in the gallery, through every unspoken prayer I'd carried for months. When the verdict came, it was almost anticlimactic. Guilty on all counts, murder in the first degree, conspiracy, fraud, and attempted homicide. Charles stared straight ahead, expression frozen. Henry's head dropped to his chest. Their lawyer closed his eyes, as if relief and defeat shared the same weight. Weeks later, I returned to the cemetery. The air was warm, the grass bright after the spring rain. I brought fresh flowers, white lilies, his favorite. "It's done, my love," I whispered, pressing my palm to the headstone. "You can rest now." A gentle wind brushed my hair, and I swear I could hear his voice, quiet and steady. "I never doubted you, Margot. That night, I brewed coffee for one, but the loneliness didn't hurt the same way. It had shape now, something I could hold, not something that held me." Ernest was gone, but he had left behind the strength I'd need to live the rest of my life with peace. Sometimes I still received letters from people who said my story gave them courage to tell their own. One woman wrote, "Your strength made me leave my abusive brother." Another wrote, "I kept my husband's ashes, but I've stopped hating him." I read every word. I didn't always reply, but I prayed for each name, whispering them like lanterns into the night. Years passed, but Spring Creek never forgot the story of Ernest and Margot Hayes. The whispers that once carried pity and scandal had softened into something else, respect, even awe. People spoke of Margot the way small towns speak of survivors, as though endurance itself were a form of sainthood. But to me, survival was not holiness. It was simply the choice to keep breathing after the fire went out. Outside, the sky broke open with sunlight, too bright, too sudden. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but I walked through them like mist. The courthouse steps felt lighter beneath my feet, as though Ernest had finally taken his hand from the weight on my shoulder. That night, I returned home and lit a candle beside Ernest's framed photo. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and smoke. "It's done," I whispered. "They heard you." In the stillness, I could almost hear his voice again, not in grief, but in peace. The flame flickered, bent slightly toward the letter resting beneath the frame, and for the first time since that terrible morning, I allowed myself to breathe. When he left, I locked the door, not out of fear, but finality. I set Ernest's letter on the table, beside the old photograph of our wedding day. For the first time in weeks, I felt my breath belong to me again. The clock ticked. Somewhere beyond the rain, the world went on pretending it hadn't just confessed. I sat down and whispered into the stillness, "I'm carrying it, Ernest." The lanterns lit. When I told Stephen about my plan, his eyes softened. "That's exactly what Ernest would have wanted," he said. Together, we drew up the documents for what would become the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes. For the first time since the funeral, I smiled without guilt. When I testified, my palms trembled only once. When they asked about the letter Ernest left me, I read it aloud, each line drawn with love and forewarning. I could feel him standing just beyond the fluorescent light. When I finished, the courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was still. Not even the air dared move. Cross-examination tried to rattle me. "Mrs. Hayes," the defense attorney said, "is it possible your grief has colored your perception? That perhaps you're seeking someone to blame?" I met his gaze. "Grief doesn't color the truth," I said. "It sharpens it." After that, even he stopped looking me in the eye. Charles broke first. The defense called him to testify, but arrogance made him careless. "Dad was reckless," he said. "He drank every night. He let the shop fall apart. I was fixing his mess." The prosecutor leaned in. "By poisoning him?" Charles's jaw twitched, his silence a confession louder than words. Henry followed on the fourth day. He couldn't lie as easily. When shown the bank transfers, his lip trembled. Charles said it was temporary. He said we'd pay it back. His voice cracked when they showed Ernest's lab tests. "I didn't know it'd kill him," he whispered. "I just wanted him to stop fighting." The judge's gavel broke the air. "Answer directly," he ordered. Henry nodded, weeping openly now. "Yes," he said. "We did it. We poisoned him." Stephen stayed by my side through all of it. Not as a savior, but as a companion in quiet moments. He never tried to replace Ernest. He understood that some loves don't end. They just change shape. Together we worked long hours, sharing coffee and silence more than conversation. There was comfort in that rhythm. The world didn't need our words. It needed our work. And that was the story of Margot Hayes, a woman who turned tragedy into truth and pain into purpose. I found the insurance papers that once caused so much pain and placed them on the table. They no longer looked like symbols of greed, but of survival. I made a decision that night. The money that had taken his life would be transformed into something that gave life. It would go to families destroyed by betrayal, to mothers who had lost faith, to those who needed proof that truth can still win. When they brought the boys in, the air shifted. Charles wore a tailored suit, still pretending the world obeyed him. Henry looked smaller, his gaze flicking between the floor and the ceiling, as if trying to find an exit in the rafters. Jasmine wasn't there. She'd left town, rumor said, unable to face either verdict or forgiveness. The prosecution opened with calm precision. Every exhibit that had once lain on my kitchen table now glowed on a courtroom screen. The whiskey bottles, the forged insurance papers, the recording of Ernest's final argument with his sons. His voice echoed through the speakers, steady and raw. "You're killing me with kindness, boys." The jury flinched. Even the judge paused his pen. The Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes grew faster than I ever imagined. What began as a small outreach in the back of the community center soon expanded into offices across the state. We helped women who had lost homes, children who had been silenced, and men who had been betrayed by their own blood. Each story carried echoes of my own. but it no longer reopened my wounds. It reminded me why I had lived. When I turned 75, the board insisted on a ceremony. Cameras, applause, speeches, all things I'd once dreaded. But that night, under soft lights and the banner, "A Decade of Healing," I looked out at the faces of people who had found hope through our work. Their eyes shimmered with the same mixture of grief and strength that once lived in mine. I realized then that grief was never meant to vanish. It was meant to become light for others still lost in the dark. If this story moved you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life tales of love, betrayal, and redemption. Tell us in the comments, what moment touched you the most? Until next time, remember, even the darkest secrets can lead to the brightest light. Every spring, I visited Ernest's grave with a single white lily. The first time I did, I cried until the grass blurred beneath me. The 10th year, I smiled instead. I could almost see him there, hands on his hips, pretending not to tear up. "You always were the stubborn one," he would have said. And he'd be right. I'd grown older, slower, but not lonely. The foundation became my second heartbeat. Young volunteers often stopped by my office, surprised to see an old woman with folders piled high and tea cooling beside her. They called me Miss Hayes, but some whispered Margot when they forgot the distance of titles. They didn't know how much it meant to me, that my name could be spoken with warmth again. After the event, I returned home to the same small house, the clock still ticking over the mantel. I poured tea instead of wine, sat by the window, and watched the moonlight slide over Ernest's framed photograph. "We did well," I whispered. "Your name lives on in kindness." The candle beside his picture flickered, just as it had years ago, bending toward the light like it remembered. Outside, the world was quiet. Somewhere, a train passed through the valley, its distant hum carrying through the night. It sounded less like departure now, and more like arrival.